The Academic Freedom Lecture Fund invites you to view the University of Michigan Senate's 20th Annual Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. This lecture was held on October 11, 2010, in the Blau Auditorium of the Stephen H. Ross School of Business on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The lecture was delivered by Michael A. Olivas, William B. Bates Distinguished Chair in Law at the University of Houston Law Center and Director of the Institute for Higher Education, Law and Governance at the University of Houston Law School. The title of Professor Olivas's lecture is God, Grades, and Sex: The Developing Law of the College Classroom. Introductory comments will be made by Edward D. Rothman, Professor of Statistics and Chair of the Senate Advisory Committee on University Affairs.
Peggy Hollingsworth was Chair of the Faculty Senate and of SACUA during the academic year 1990 to 1991, when the Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture was established. In fact, she's only the second woman in the history of the university to be elected at that time Chair of the Senate. Peggy is now emerita, has had a distinguished career at Michigan. In 1999-2000, she served also as president of Sigma Chi, the scientific research society comprised at that time of well over 80,000 scientists and engineers. She's held numerous positions here at the University of Michigan. She's also active at Bowling Green State University, where she serves as director of the Bowling Green State University Foundation. She's also the founding member of the Coalition for the Advancement of Blacks in Biomedical Sciences. Since 1991, she has worked with a group of distinguished active and retired faculty members and others, nationally and internationally, to perpetuate the lecture series and maintain a very high standard of excellence for the speakers. I urge you to peruse the list of past lectures in your program, and you'll find evidence for my assertions. Pretty impressive list. President of the fund, Peggy, serves with the chair of the Faculty Senate, me, and the president of the Ann Arbor chapter, the American Association of University Professors, Bill Ensminger, on a committee to select the Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture. And though we who serve with her play a transient role in the process, one name's a constant, and that's Peggy Hollingsworth. Not only have Peggy's efforts been Herculean, but her efforts have been, as imagined by Maimonides, reflective of the higher level of giving. We faculty are extremely grateful to you, Peggy. Would you please come to the podium? I ask that we each show our appreciation to Peggy with a round of applause.
Thank you, Ed, for the kind introduction. Someone asked if the figure on the poster shown on the screen behind me was a picture of today's speaker. The response, of course, was that since this lecture series is based upon free speech, we do want our lecturer to speak very freely, and we would not show him with his mouth taped shut. The generic professor in the poster does have his mouth taped to illustrate the theme of the forthcoming lecture. Before we start, I want to introduce you to two favorite cousins of mine who are here from California and who for 20 years have been subjected to much discourse about the Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture, but who have never had the opportunity to attend one. Al Bradley is a retired Finnish carpenter whose works grace many upscale California homes, as well as our own. His wife, Colette Bradley, is an equally talented designer of furniture and interiors, and they're right here. On behalf of the directors and members of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund, many of whom are with us today, I would like to welcome you to the 20th Annual University of Michigan Senate's Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom. This lecture series honors three former University of Michigan faculty members whose academic and intellectual freedoms were seriously compromised during the so-called McCarthy era. The most senior faculty member was Mark Nickerson, who was a tenured associate professor in the medical school when he was summoned in November 1953 to appear in Lansing before a subcommittee of the House Un-American Activities Committee chaired by Michigan Congressman Kit Francis Clardy. This slide shows Professor Nickerson on the left as he appeared in the Michigan Daily the day after the Lansing hearings, and on the right, the day of the first annual Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture in 1991. Clement L. Markert was an assistant professor of biology when he appeared before the Clardy Committee. This slide shows Professor Markert on the left as he appeared in the Michigan Daily the day after the Lansing hearings in 1953, and on the right on the day of the first annual Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture. Both Professors Nickerson and Markert are deceased, but during their lifetimes they attended most of the annual lectures in Ann Arbor. Chandler Davis was an instructor in mathematics when he appeared before the Clardy Committee. This slide shows Professor Davis on the left as he appeared in the Michigan Daily the day after the Lansing hearings in 1953, and on the right on the day of the first annual Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture. Professor Davis has attended all of the lectures over the past 20 years, and he is with us today. Accounts of the three honorees can be viewed on the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund webpage referenced on the slides. Before I introduce Professor Davis to you, however, I would like to show you a few more slides. This slide shows this slide shows two young Ann Arbor couples sometime in the early 1950s on a trip east, which the four took before the infamous Lansing hearings. In the background are Chandler Davis and his wife, Natalie Zeman Davis. In the foreground are Elizabeth Duvon and her husband, Vic. Libby Duvon was a distinguished professor of psychology at the University of Michigan, and her husband, Vic, a local attorney. The car is a 1950 Power Glide Chevrolet convertible, a gift from Natalie's father. Note how happy everyone is in that picture. The 20th year of the lecture series has been exceptional in many ways. Chandler Davis is not only a renowned emeritus professor of mathematics at the University of Toronto, but an accomplished author of science fiction and other prose, as well as poetry. A selection of his prose, It Walks in Beauty, has been put together by Joss Lucan and published earlier this year. Here you see a cover of his book on the left and Chandler on the right. Natalie Zeman Davis, who also is with us today, is a noted historian whose scholarship has been recognized this year with the prestigious Holberg International Memorial Prize, awarded annually for outstanding scholarly work in the fields of the arts and humanities, social sciences, law, and theology, and which is funded by the government of Norway. This award is analogous to the Nobel Prize. Natalie and Chandler, will you please stand so that we can welcome you back to Ann Arbor and express our congratulations for your most recent accomplishments. October is Hispanic Heritage Month, and as part of the celebration at the University of Michigan, today's lecturer made a presentation last night at the Rackham Amphitheater, during which he showed the PBS documentary, A Class Apart, and discussed his book, Colored Men and Hombres Aquí, Hernandez v. Texas and the Emergence of Mexican-American Lawyering. The beautiful poster shown on the screen was designed by Nancy Torres, an LS&A undergraduate student in economics. This event was co-sponsored by the Latino Studies Program, which is directed by Professor Maria Cotera, by the King Chavez Parks Visiting Professor Program, and the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund. I hope that some of those present today were able to attend that event yesterday. On the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture Series, I will be remiss were I not to thank those who not only have made the lecture series possible, but who also have made them so successful. First, the University of Michigan Faculty Senate Assembly, who adopted the resolution that established the series. The American Association of University Professors, AAUP, which provided a grant to support the first lecture with the proviso that our faculty matched the grant. The directors and members of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund. The fund initially was established by the Senate Assembly to organize and obtain independent funding for the lecture series. Many over the years who ardently support the cause of academic and intellectual freedom have given whatever they can afford to sustain and promote the series. In addition, this year, a contribution for the lecture series was included in the philanthropy of an anonymous donor. Some academic and administrative units of the University of Michigan today provide support both in money and in space for the lecture series, as well as the organizations and groups listed in your program. The advisory board of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund and the past Davis Markert Nickerson lecturers have had a key role in the recruitment of the distinguished scholars who deliver the annual lecture. Finally, the staff of the Faculty Senate Office, currently Thomas Schneider and Linda Carr, as well as Emily Arntz, and the students who work in the Faculty Senate Office provide the necessary staff and logistical support. This year, Jeffrey Lee of the local chapter of AUP and the following students who assisted us were Paul Arias, doctoral candidate in mechanical engineering and chair of the Hispanic Heritage Month Planning Committee, Catherine Ergiles, an LSNA undergraduate, Tara Mather, a master's degree candidate in urban planning, and Paula Pulowski, an LSNA undergraduate in French and political science. I would also like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation to my beloved husband, Professor Charles Smith, who has been the chauffeur for our guests throughout the 20 years, as well as a word processor and envelope sealer, in addition to innumerable other activities that made this lecture series successful. Thank you, Ted. A benefit that I personally have derived from the lecture series is the opportunity each year for the past 20 years to communicate with the annual lecturer as she or he prepares to deliver the lecture. The interaction that I have had with this year's Davis Markert Nickerson lecture has been particularly delightful. I hope that Professor Olivas will forgive me for sharing with you just one of our not infrequent email exchanges. Olivas, under separate cover, I have sent a CD, some pictures, and a short bio. Due to my eerie resemblance to Jimmy Smits, I have reserved all European film rights, but will sign the release form and fax it back to you. Hollingsworth, you are so funny! Exclamation marks. Years ago, we were in New York and saw Jimmy Smits in the Broadway production of Anna in the Tropics. After intermission, the curtains opened and there was Smits nude to the waist, lying in the center of the stage. It was necessary to bring in the paramedics for all of the women, perhaps some of the men also, who still had any reasonable levels of circulating sex hormones. We will need your DNA only if we can determine a way to make it profitable enough to support future DMN lectures. Olivas, people who see me naked also swoon, I fear. And now our new provost, Philip Hanlon, will introduce this year's University of Michigan Senate's Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom.
Thank you, Peggy. This is a week of anniversaries at the University of Michigan. Many of you will be involved in the 50th anniversary of the speech, which launched the Peace Corps later this week. And today, as has been mentioned a couple of times, is the 20th anniversary of the Davis Markert Nickerson Academic and Intellectual Freedom Lecture Series, which we're here to note today. Peggy said a bit about the three people involved, Chandler Davis, who is sitting here, as you know. I want to make a personal note on my relationship to Chandler Davis, which began a long time ago, early in my mathematical career, long before I understood the significance of his history with the University of Michigan. Chandler was kind enough, as a older mathematical colleague and editor of a prestigious journal, to reach out to me, offer me support, encouragement, advice, and mentorship, and I greatly appreciate that to this day. And as I understand it, he spent the early part of this afternoon meeting with students here at the University of Michigan and speaking to them, so he's still working on behalf of other people, as he has his whole career. So we appreciate that, Chandler. Today, we're very honored to have Professor Michael Olivas with us to continue the exploration of academic and intellectual freedom that this lecture series represents. Dr. Olivas is the William B. Bates Distinguished University Chair in Law at the University of Houston, where he's also the director of the Institute for Higher Education Law and Governance. Dr. Olivas is an accomplished scholar whose research is at the intersection of higher education, immigration, and the role and position of underrepresented groups in our society. He holds graduate degrees in English, higher education, and law, definitely a potent combination that leads to clear and careful explication of complex legal questions. Professor Levis is perhaps best known for his work on the history of Hernandez versus Texas, a Supreme Court case from the 1950s. This case extended the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to Mexican Americans who had been excluded from jury duty. Dr. Oliva's forthcoming book, Ask Not for Whom the Bell Tolls, focuses on Plyer versus Doe, a key case that affirms the rights of children to education through 12th grade, regardless of their immigration status. He also works on a range of higher education questions, including access to college, the cost of college, and prepaid tuition plans. His scholarly contributions have been recognized with many honors, including election to the National Academy of Education and the American Law Institute. Eager to contribute to intellectual and policy conversations, Dr. Oliva serves as trustee of the College Board and the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. He is also president-elect of the Association of American Law Schools. So as this introduction suggests, Dr. Olivas is very busy and engaged with some of the important questions of our time. His talk this afternoon is titled God, Grades, and Sex, the Developing Law of the College Classroom. I anticipate a fascinating lecture and lively discussion afterwards, in keeping with the history and values of the Davis, Markert, Nickerson lecture series. Please join me in welcoming Michael Olivas to Michigan.
You notice that he didn't say that I'm an Ohio State graduate. A deliberate and conscientious omission, I suspect. I would be remiss if I didn't, however, note our rise in the rankings this week to number 1, and commiserate with you about your according decline in the rankings this week. The best thing about me is that I don't use overheads, so and this mouse is going to trap me here. I want to thank Professor Hollingsworth as well as Professor Davis and the many extraordinary people who've extended me such courtesies upon my time here. I regret that Dean Evan Kamiker, who suggested I do this, couldn't be here today because of knee surgery. I have to say this appears to be ground zero for knee surgery because Peggy's cousin has had it, her husband has had it, and I have gotten much more advice about deteriorating arthritic knees than I really ever wanted. And I want to know why I didn't have more medical faculty with me tonight at dinner instead of all these damn mathematicians who aren't going to be of any help. They all seem to walk completely upright, erect, and handle the stairs well. First, it's important to say what I'm not going to talk about today, although I know that all the sex talk is in the air, and I want to strike while that iron is hot. I'm not going to talk about fair use of materials and copyright in class, although that's an important area. I'm not going to talk about whether or not emails constitute a hostile environment. For that, you can see a recent MALDEF case, Rodriguez versus Maricopa Community College, or the recent University of Illinois adjunct who sent out emails concerning religious faith in class. I'm not going to talk about exam anxiety, although I think that not only will anxiety increase, but litigation concerning exam anxiety will increase along with attention to disabilities issues. If it has to do with bad knees, by the way, I'm all for it. Is this a bad connection here? This is good stuff, people. I'm not going to talk about wireless access in classrooms, although there are cases working their way through the system where students have sued faculty for turning off wireless access in class. It apparently interferes with their Pong playing. I'm not going to talk about cheating and website password protected websites. And I'm not going to talk about syllabi, although next time I give a talk like this, I probably will, because it's a major developing area due to state laws that require faculty to post their syllabi. No doubt to check for various forms of godlessness that will be evident. And also, when you find out I'm from New Mexico, some of you can be very disappointed that I will not talk about the UNM professor who moonlighted as Mistress Jade, the dominatrix, who on her website offered that she could interact with you as either biker bitch, imperious goddess, or stern teacher ready to punish unruly students. And where it turned out she hired some of her graduate students. I'll simply leave it to your imagination to follow through that. Having eliminated all of these extremely important and interesting issues, I still think that I've got grist for your mill and I hope it's worth your while. What I'd like to talk about is a developing law where students sue their faculty for activities that occur in class. And let me just say, as I look around at the young faculty of the University of Michigan, a term as I've turned 59 that continues to move up, a term that continues to move up, I'd like to think that people of our generation simply respected faculty so much that they would never sue. And in fact, all the evidence bears this out. There were very few cases where students challenged faculty members. They may have dropped their classes, may have given them bad evaluations, may have directed bad karma at them, may have done any number of things. But since the 1960s, with the increasing attention to student issues in colleges and universities, particularly following cases that allowed students to sue for their having been dismissed, it's very clear that this is a pathway that many students have found attractive. And frankly, as a law professor who turns out many university attorneys and people who sue universities, I think it's been a salutary development. I've even been sued in class on the legal theory in my chairing the university's residency appeals committee that the person wanted to be admitted as a Texas resident because he was a genuine, real, honest-to-God Texan, as if that's a legal theory, let me just say, as opposed to an explanation, an apology. That's better, okay. So the trick is if I just wait a little bit, okay. But in several important and recent legal cases, faculty and student rights have clearly come into more direct conflict. One of my favorite, and sometimes I just could not pick these names, pitted a public university against an exercise physiology professor in Bishop versus Aronoff, note the irony here, who invited students in his class to judge him by Christian standards and to admonish him if he deviated from these tenets. He said, in effect, I think that publishing makes no sense. I want to guide my life by Christian principles. I want any of you to call me out. By the way, on Thursday nights at my home, we're going to have special sections that you're not required to attend on the relationship between God and exercise physiology. And you're not required to come. Notice the Jimmy Smits-like acting reflexes there. And the appeals court held that colleges exercise broad authority over pedagogical issues and that a teacher's speech can be taken as directly and deliberately representative of the school. Now, this is deciding on far more grounds than they needed to, because there is no doubt but that his imprecations in class were threatening to students, whether Christian or non-Christian. To judge him by a certain standard signals his own belief system, and you can imagine how you would feel if a Muslim professor or a Jewish professor said, please judge me by these standards. My guess is that the police would be called in short order. Nonetheless, they struck down his behavior where he had sued after having been sanctioned for it, although he did get tenure. But this troubling logic that the teacher's speech can be taken as directly and deliberately representative of the school is really troubling, because I don't consider myself directly or even indirectly, even obliquely, even diagonally representative of the school. It reaches the correct decision to admonish the professor, but it does so for the wrong reasons and rests upon the erroneous ground that faculty views are those of the institution. The court could have more parsimoniously and persuasively decided the same result, by analyzing the peculiar role of religion injected into secular fields of study, especially when the teacher invites a particular religious scrutiny. For example, I could understand, even in a public institution, a comparative religion class where everybody around the table discussed their own belief system, so you understand where people sit and therefore where they stand. In Lynch versus Indiana Student University, Professor Lynch opened every class at Indiana State University with a prayer, saying that if it bothered students, they could wait outside until he had finished. The court and the school, of course, precluded the practice, finding that the Establishment Clause mandated that he discontinue the practice. In another course, a student art teacher was dismissed for his habit of not supervising his students. He argued that this technique of not appearing for an art class taught students to act more independently. The court disagreed that his behavior was a protected form of professorial speech, as did a court that considered another professor's extensive use of profanity in the classroom. 3 professors, as well as other professionals, have lost their position for making derogatory references to one of their students as Monica Lewinsky in class. Remarkably, they aren't the only professors to have used this. In fact, there is a developing line of Monica Lewinsky jurisprudence where professors, all male, in an attempt to put down students, all female, have called them this, and one even referred to her as his cuspidor in class. I think he actually meant his humidor, if you recall the facts. But there you have it. If you're going to insult people, at least get the details right. Now, these and other cases have made it clear that students have some rights in a classroom, while more well-known cases such as Levin versus Harleston and Silva versus University of New Hampshire have made it clear that courts will still go a long way in professing protectors' ideas, however controversial, such as those of Levin, and teaching styles, however offensive, such as Silva. Silva was the communications writer at the University of New Hampshire who said, "Imagine life as a vibrator. Discuss." This, I take it, was an open-ended question. But the proper configuration of professorial academic freedom is one that is both normative and resilient enough to resist the extremes from either within or without. To fend off the New Hampshire legislative inquiry of Sweezy, the 1957 or 58 leading case concerning bringing in a Harvard professor to testify on his friends and to the whack, and the proselytizing of Bishop, who, after all, got tenure notwithstanding this particular pedagogical style. In this view, professors have wide-ranging discretion to undertake the research and to formulate teaching methods in their classrooms and in their laboratories. And I might add, by extension, to their field sites and any other place where our work is done, whether it be a dig in southern New Mexico or taking a group of students to Amsterdam, whatever. However, this autonomy is, within very broad limits, highly contingent upon traditional norms of peer review, codes of ethical behavior, and institutional standards. So that if I were a theater teacher teaching students how to do fencing, grabbing their arms and moving them around so that they wouldn't pierce each other with swords, or if I were in a physical education class, not touting the virtues of Christianity, let's say, but instead helping someone tumble or get the archery position straight. That, of course, would be highly appropriate and contextual. Doing so in an evidence class, clearly not so. I might add, just as an aside, that I don't usually resort to athletic metaphors. When the urge to exercise comes over me, I lie down until it passes. I believe that your heart has a certain number of beats in it. If you speed it up, you're going to die sooner. And I remember that Jim Fox died while jogging. Now, in the most favorable circumstances, these norms are going to be faculty-driven, subject to administrative guidelines for ensuring the requisite due process and fairness. Even the highly optimistic and altruistic 1915 AAUP Declaration of Principles holds individual teachers should not be exempt from all restraints as to the manner of their utterances, either within or without the university. In short, academic freedom doesn't give carte blanche to professors, but rather vests the faculty with establishing and enforcing standards of behavior to be reasonably and appropriately applied in evaluations. Although I'm attempting to persuade you that the academic common law is highly normative and contextual and faculty-driven, I've not lost sight of the range of acceptable practices and the extraordinary heterogeneity found in classroom styles. All of us evolve a certain style, one that makes sense to us, and that is appropriate as long as we stick to germane material, as long as we don't exploit it, as long as we don't use it as a platform for introducing irrelevant ideas into the discussion, and as long as we don't use it to single out students for disapprobation. And by that, I don't mean wincing when they ask a stupid question. That's sort of what you're hoping for at some point. Our hopes are often realized, I have to say, of course, but what it means, of course, is that you use these as moments, that you plant them into your curriculum, that you handle the ones that are fraught with tension. Teaching rape, for example, racial profiling, the death penalty, abortion cases, death penalty cases. These are all very difficult cases that require not a dry recitation of the facts, but an importation of real-life experiences and social norms, particularly as the norms themselves change. And I think that students have expectations that these will be done in a reasonable fashion. Nonetheless, data suggesting that over half of all collegiate women have experienced inappropriate sexual touching or sexual assault at some point may mean that many of the people in your class are going to have contexts that are very uncomfortable, and I think that you can't avoid them. In fact, you'd be wrong for avoiding them, but you can make certain that you don't do it with resorts to Monica Lewinsky or leering or other suggestive language or highly sexualized or personalized issues. Additionally, persuasive research has emerged to show that persons who are trained in different academic disciplines view pedagogy differently. John Braxton, for example, a distinguished higher education scholar, and his colleagues summarize how these norms operate across disciplines. Personal controls that induce individual conformity to teaching norms are internalized to various degrees through the graduate school socialization process. Graduate school attendance in general and doctoral study in particular are regarded as a powerful socialization experience. The potency of this process lies not only in the development of knowledge, skills, and competencies, but also in the inculcation of norms, attitudes, and values. This socialization process entails a total learning situation, and through these interpersonal relationships with faculty, values, knowledge, and skills are inculcated. We help our junior colleagues get their labs underway and get their scholarship started and help them file their papers for grants and so forth. We don't always teach them. In fact, there is nothing so singularly lonely as teaching at the front end and a sense that you're finally on your own, and after wishing for adulthood all those years as a graduate student, finding it in class being thrown into the deep end. Moreover, to paraphrase Tolstoy, all of us are inculcated differently. For me to grab a student and put my hands on his chest would be extraordinarily wrong in my immigration law class, but it could happen regularly, as I suggested earlier, in a voice class, a physical education course, or an acting workshop. Discussing one's religious views in exercise physiology may be wrong and itself harassing, but certainly I could understand how that might be appropriate in as I said earlier, a comparative religion class. Discussions of sexuality, which would be salacious in a legal ethics course, would be appropriately central to a seminar in human sexuality, a case that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Each academic field has evolved its own norms and conventions. And this certainly doesn't mean that we all hew to those, but it does give you a sense of what the average is and what regression to the mean is and what outliers are. However, courts are not in the business of contextualizing pedagogical disputes. And I want to give you just the summary of facts from a recent case, Minconi versus Nassau County Community College, that wended its awkward way through the judicial system. Although it has forebears in many other cases, it will be sufficient to make my point. If colleges do not police themselves, others will. Disputes between teachers and pupils are on the rise, and poor fact patterns and sloppy practices will lead inevitably to substantial external control over the classroom. And by external, I mean trustees as well as legislators and other authoritative bodies. One other thread that this case arose in a community college where the schools tend to be top-down and very hierarchical, and yet the law will apply to all of us in all the other settings. And so it's a troubling development that a number of the really hard cases concerning pedagogy are arising in community colleges. This case began as a request for public records, or in this case, course materials for Physical Education 251, Family Life and Human Sexuality. The course is taught in several sections to almost 3,000 students a year, and in the first round of Mincon, a senior citizen auditor who enrolled under the terms of a free senior program for non-credit reviewed the course materials before he took the class, which was to be offered in the summer of 1995, and he sued to enjoin the course from using the materials or from using federal funds to counsel abortion in the course materials. Well, the course materials had nothing at all to do with abortion. It was a course in human sexuality, and he hadn't taken the course for credit, and he hadn't even gotten the course in the course yet. He was complaining about the syllabus. He was a representative of a group that was formed for this purpose, had the clever name of OSCAR, the Organization of Senior Citizens and Retailers. There you have it. Now, they filed the lawsuit with 8 causes of action, and I won't go through all of them except to say this. They said that it teaches behavior that violated Section 130.00 of the New York State Penal Law, sodomy statutes, and it violated federal law concerning religious neutrality by singling out one correct view of human sexuality. As best I can understand, it had to do with Buddhism and Tantra. Now, I've never really been able to find that, so if any of you want to send me a private email to my private account, please do so. They also said that it disregarded the duty to warn students of course content so they could decide whether or not to enroll in the course. It endangered minors who might be enrolled in the course, and it violated federal law enjoining abortion counseling. Well, this broad frontal attack on virtually every real or imagined piece of the course, even when the plaintiff wasn't enrolled in the course for credit, enjoined the course even before the term began, before he sat in class for day one. But the wide-ranging claims, particularly those that allege religious bias, are so vague and poorly formulated it was difficult to believe they would survive. But in fact, they did at least enough to make their way into my case book, available in fine bookstores everywhere. And yet this is not the only such class. In a case in the 10th Circuit in Utah, a case called Axon Flynn, a theater student who was a member of the Mormon faith took an elective theater class and objected strenuously when the teachers had them, as a pedagogical practice, read and enact parts from standard plays. And by that I don't mean, Debbie Does Dallas or things. I'm talking about Edward Albee, other renowned playwrights. She said she would not use those words because they did not honor God. They referred to sexuality outside the context of marriage, and she just wouldn't do it. And she eventually withdrew from the class, but then brought a case on religious grounds, arguing that this violated her rights as a Christian not to exercise her own religious faith in class, and that it would be inappropriate. And she loses, predictably, I think, at the trial level. But the 10th Circuit actually says, well, there was some snarkiness on the part of a faculty member. Not that you can imagine a faculty member ever having been snarky. I've always assumed they were different in class than they were in faculty meetings, perhaps wrongly. And that the university while the university had advanced articulate and reasonable and non-discriminatory reasons for having chosen these classes, and it was the teacher's call after all, they said that the university had made accommodations in the past for religion, citing state law concerning rescheduling of classes on the religious holidays. A statute that, by the way, is almost in all 50 states, so that students won't be penalized if they take Hanukkah or Wiccan's Day, whatever the non-denominational. If you miss a class due to religious observations, in most states you get to make up the class and it can't be held against you. They used this attendance policy as evidence that accommodations have been made. Once you make an accommodation, then they should be making pedagogical accommodations. The university decided a case concerning a Mormon student might be tried in a federal jury in Salt Lake City, might be unavailing, and so they settled it. Might be unavailing, and so they decided to punt on that, leaving all of those of us who live in the 10th Circuit, as I do when I'm in New Mexico, vulnerable on these particular grounds. I think that it can be cabined off a bit. Sue Ellen, you can tell me later if you believe that it can be in this district as well, or this circuit. But I think that these, as well as other cases, challenges brought by creationist students against biology and physics professors, students in North Carolina who the week of orientation brought suit in federal court because of their reluctance to read materials that had been assigned to all incoming freshmen for orientation, a book about the Quran. Not the Quran, mind you, but a book about the Quran. I think that a book for having non-Muslim students read the Quran would actually be a very enlightening and thought-provoking and certainly stimulating kind of class, but these students were having nothing of it. Again, they hadn't stepped on campus yet as students and were suing because of the materials assigned to which they objected. Now, if we begin with the premise that faculty members have the absolute right, within the limits I've already articulated of germaneness and institutional practice, to assign whatever text they wish, subject only to the text being appropriate for the course, into academic custom. That means if I wrote the book, I discharge any profits that might come from it, etc. And I couldn't assign my book in subject A in a class in subject D, for example. Now, sometimes this means that I have to yield to my departmental prerogatives. My department might say, well, we don't want to have 15 freshman composition texts, so we'll agree on 5 and you can assign any 5 of those. I then don't retain academic freedom to use a 6th one after I have ceded my communitarian rights within the larger group for pedagogical purposes, or I don't get to assign grades in a way that's at odds with departmental grading practices, where for perfectly good and fair reasons across multiple sections, there may be an enforced median, for example, or a curve of some sort. So if we begin with this premise, this means that sometimes a compromise may be in the works, because not everybody can write their own book. And I would say that as AUP General Counsel, I would have had no qualms in defending the course materials, including those that went to 3,000 students in a human sexuality course, a course, by the way, required for teacher education in the state of New York. Provided that these books are chosen by professionals with considerable expertise in the field, and the course is widely accepted and regularly fully enrolled, I would say then that these comport with a broad but cabined reading of academic freedom, one that would extend to virtually every reasonable pedagogical practice. But sometimes faculty simply go too far. In the fall semester last year, Lopez, in the case Lopez versus Kendelly, was a student in Speech 101 taught by Professor John Madison. For one assignment, Madison directed his students to make an informative speech on a topic of their choosing. Lopez was a devout Christian who believes, as a tenet of his faith, that he must share his religious beliefs with others. For this assignment, Lopez chose to speak about God and the ways in which he'd witnessed God act both in his life and the lives of others. In the course of giving his speech, he read a dictionary definition of marriage as being a union between a man and a woman, and he read 2 verses from the Bible. After he made these statements, but while in the middle of his speech, Professor Madison interrupted Lopez, calling him a fascist bastard, and refused to allow him to finish his speech. Madison told the class that anyone who was offended could leave. When no one left, Madison dismissed class, and in lieu of giving him a grade, he wrote on the speech evaluation form, "Ask God what your grade is." In my private practice, I go home and pray every night for fact patterns like this. He also said that proselytizing is inappropriate in public school. Now, it plays itself out, and the professor has been admonished for this. And though the text of his speech isn't on the record, he did cite Romans 10:9 and Matthew 37:38. I referred those to you for your own reading. A professor who says, write on a topic of any subject in which you wish, simply, I might add, invites this. One could have easily imagined an assignment that said, pick a subject, and you pick 5 in advance that are appropriate. Write about public policy on healthcare, right? I don't care what they are, pick them and give some details so that you rule out the outliers that are inevitably going to come in a plural society. O'Neill versus Falcon in the West District of Texas last year, professor had a concern over the potentially disruptive nature of the subject of abortion and whether or not that constituted legitimate pedagogical reason for him to prohibit a student from choosing the topic of abortion in a speech communications class. The court held that this was appropriate because the professor was trying to set out examples, and he argued that abortion is one that is not science. This is a speech communication class. We've all heard about this. I would like you to pick another topic other than that. And so he ruled out several topics, but he included several others, and the student chose to do it anyway. So picking a potentially disruptive subject doesn't necessarily mean you're ruling out an issue that would be of interest to students, because you give them a variety of these. And I would argue that this is a kind of pull and tug that all of us feel on a regular basis. Now, cases like this are fraught with implications for higher education practice, especially for appropriate teacher behavior. In Cohen versus San Bernardino Community College, the district court could have gone in the other direction by stressing academic freedom primarily rather than balancing the competing interests. He said that this is a case where a professor has students read Hustler magazine. Just for the uninformed in the room, Hustler magazine is a very salacious, at least by standards when I was a kid, tempted to read it, that he decided would be useful because at least it did his students reading. Yeah, well, let me just say that dog wouldn't hunt in the 10th Circuit, in all likelihood. If Edward Albee won't hunt, I don't think that Larry Flint will. But here's what the court said. The court said that the admonishment had been mild. That is, he was told to stop teaching from Hustler and other pornographic materials in his remedial English class because many of the people in the class felt that it was harassing them, that it was a matter of their free religious exercise. The court says, though, a case in which a professor is terminated or directly censored presents a far different balancing question. But I would say, does it really? He chose the materials, and while I would, as department chair, would have admonished him, It's pretty clear that absent a policy concerning acceptable materials or an agreement by the department what you ought to be using, in some cases so that you can get discounts for the students on multiple purchases, and you want to have certain material covered because it's a prerequisite for a sophomore class, and so the kind of sequencing becomes important so everybody has the same thing. But having one teacher as an outlier using letters to the editor from Hustler about sexual fetishes is probably not a good idea for a remedial English class, or any other class for that matter. Additionally, there is the issue of the solution to the conundrum of faculty autonomy and sexual harassment jurisprudence. The difficulty is acknowledging that the classroom can be a hostile environment in some instances. The AUP, in order to do this, singles out for disapprobation and for prohibition, of course, sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other speech or conduct of a sexual nature which might constitute sexual harassment if advances or requests are made under circumstances implying that one's response might affect academic or personal decisions. So whether if such speech or conduct is directed at another and is either abusive or severely humiliating, back to my Monica Lewinsky materials. Whether or not such speech or conduct is reasonably regarded as offensive and substantially impairs the academic or work opportunity of students, colleagues, or coworkers. If it takes place in a teaching context, it must also be persistent, pervasive, and not germane. That is, inappropriate behavior must be all of this to rise to the level of sexual harassment. Now, the academic setting is distinct from the workplace in that wide latitude is required for professional judgment in determining the appropriate content and presentation of academic material. In our search for the perfect, clarifying epiphany, the one that will illuminate once and for all examples that can guide behavior, this proposed policy probably falls short. What's severely humiliating? Is it more than humiliating? How much more? How long does harassment have to persist in order to be found persistent? Isn't the classroom a workplace for all of us? That's certainly where I do my work. To me, in interpreting academic standards, it isn't surprising that things work so badly, although I could literally give you dozens of cases for each of these. What's amazing to me is that they work so well. Every day, millions of us have transactions with millions of students at the other end of the log, in our classrooms, in our places of employment, where we exchange information and where we all learn. My own experience as a student and as a professor lead me to believe that any comprehensive theory of professorial authority to determine how it shall be taught, considered one of the 4 vital tenets of academic freedom, must incorporate a feedback mechanism for students to take issue, to voice complaints, and to point out remarks or attitudes that may be insensitive or disparaging. At a minimum, faculty should encourage students to speak privately to identify uncomfortable situations. Professor Bishop asked his students to point out inconsistencies between his Christian perspectives and his lifestyle in class. Now, this is excessive and could itself provoke anxiety on the part of both Christian and non-Christian students. But a modest attempt to avoid stigmatizing words and examples is certainly in order for teachers, and schools should have in place some mechanism to address these issues and resolve problems. The way the University of Utah resolved this difficult situation they found themselves in the Axe and Flynn case, was that they formed a committee that would hear any such complaints. It's my understanding that in the 10 years that have passed, almost 12 years now that have passed since that case, only one case has been brought forward to them, because students feel at least that there's a mechanism and there's some transparency for them to raise these issues. I also suspect that a number of professors simply are on better notice. As I said, I thought that case was excessive and badly decided, but it certainly had the effect of probably getting faculty members to think about their pedagogical practices. I cringe, for example, when I see exam questions, as I have, that consign Jose, Maria, and Rufus to the criminal questions as perpetrators, or when in-class hypotheticals use terminology such as illegal aliens, and one particularly pernicious one, anchor babies, or use sexist examples and stereotypes to illustrate legal points. The professor thought he was being clever for the most part. And I say he because I've never seen a woman that's ever done this. Maybe I've just come across a better class of woman, but women just don't do this. This is a male prerogative to be stupid in class. Now, finally, there's the issue of grading. For years, I've told my students that no properly awarded grade has ever been overturned by a court, and so they shouldn't try it and overturn mine. But that was before Sylvester versus Texas Southern University. This is, I believe, the very first federal case where a grade is overturned. But I still believe that the circumstances are so bizarre that no one can really insist that the grade was ever properly awarded. And therein lies a very odd tale, one that should make everyone aware of just how obstinate a faculty member can be and how badly a mistake can compound without proper faculty or administrative leadership. Karen Sylvester, a 2L at Thurgood Marshall Law School at Texas Southern, was at the top of her class, having received all A's. In the spring of 1994, she completed her Wills and Trust class and was awarded a D. This had the effect of dropping her from first, whereas a C or a pass would have kept her in first place. First, she protested to the associate dean because she couldn't get her faculty member to respond or to schedule an appointment. She goes to the associate dean, who didn't respond. The next semester, she protested in writing and did so several times without receiving any response. And the professor was later asked to produce her exam book, and he said it had been lost. Now, mind you, there was a provision there that students could challenge grades by taking it up the ladder, like many schools have, if not oftenly invoked, certainly a clear path that begins with your professor and then moves upwards. After a more thorough search, it was discovered. She had appealed to the law school's committee that had review powers, a standing committee that had included faculty and student members. But nearly a year later, when she was scheduled to graduate, she sought to enjoin the graduation ceremony until her grade and its effect upon her rank in class could be resolved. TSU had promised the judge that if he allowed the ceremony to go forward, it would review the case and adjust her standing accordingly. They took that time because they said, well, we really shouldn't have students on this committee because then they'll see other grades and students will know more about students and it might be a violation of FERPA. Well, they had this procedure in place and they simply dragged their heels. What follows, however, is not pretty. The judge found, quote, Professor Bullock was defiant. The court ordered him to meet with the student to review the grade. As she now lived in Dallas, she had to return to Houston, where it developed the professor had no answer key or hadn't used one, and so he could not review the exam properly. Angrily, the judge ordered him to pay her travel expenses and to attach all subsequent meetings scheduled on this issue. The record tersely records he did neither. At the next court session, the judge sent marshals, the gendarme, out to fetch the missing professor who admitted he'd received proper notice and simply had chosen to ignore it. The issue was punted back to the law school committee, which decided, contrary to its published regulations, that students couldn't serve on the committee since there were privacy issues. The committee, without its student members, didn't have a quorum and decided the review had been adequate and that no inconsistencies were found. Yet one member told the court that the committee had been informed by the professor that the correct answer to the essay question had been yes. Just in case you were nodding off, the correct answer to the essay question had been yes, the one to which he had lost the exam key. The judge, incredulous that this defiance had been ratified by the committee, threw the book at them. He wrote in a remarkable and sweeping voice, governmental actions cannot be arbitrary. Having no basis for comparison is arbitrary. Changing the committee on the chairman's malicious whim is arbitrary. Once a committee had been changed from the official university constituted form, it was nothing but a mob. He ordered that she be given a pass for the course and that she be listed as co-valedictorian, which he considered extraordinary actions needed to provide what he called an equitable adjustment. I stand by my argument that no grade properly awarded has ever been overturned in court. This is not such a grade. It also shows, as important as tenure is, Title III federal judges have superior positions in life. There are many, many other examples that I could have given, and I chose from some that I thought would have the most relevance to people of good faith, showing that if you do the reasonable thing and the right thing, what most of us would consider, having taken a vote, to be the appropriate thing, that outliers may not have protection in either direction. That is, if you go too far in one way, you will harm the student. If you go too far in the other way, you'll harm the professor's interests. As with so many things in life, it is in the large medium area where truth exists. I think that with reasonableness and consistency, not making students uncomfortable, at least not doing so directly. On this issue, let me just say that I consider it my job to make students uncomfortable. I studied to be a Catholic priest for 8 years, and I left that study because I was so much better at afflicting the comfortable than I ever was at comforting the afflicted. That said, trying to put students down in class or make them uncomfortable with the relationship you have with them, the pedagogical relationship, is very different than asking a woman who might have had a sexual assault to play the role of a prosecutor. Someone who may have been a player in his day to play the role who's bragging. I have a lot of these students in class who sort of sit back and say, well, they never caught me. Have them play the defense lawyer or move them around so that they all have to play roles that they're not comfortable with. I think that this is how they're going to learn. It's the only way they're going to learn. It's the only way it'll approximate practice where you don't get to choose your clients. Mr. Chips never makes his way in. It's always the Silvas of the world who present these kinds of issues. Silva, just recall, was the guy that said, life is a vibrator. He later said he meant the kind of vibrators that you use for massages at the barber. I made a living defending faculty, and I have a good sense of what's appropriate and what's not. I'm also not a prude, and I realize that there are many different norms, and I've seen a lot of them. There is no pass for putting students down in class. And by that, I don't mean moving on after they've answered incorrectly. And sometimes the urge comes up and seizes you by the throat when a student says something dumb, because it is dumb. But that's why they're students. That's why they pay us the big bucks, to point out not that they're dumb, but that the question might have been framed this, or here's the issues that really are in play. And the need to put people down is so close to the surface in many very good faculty that it's sometimes difficult to resist. I would say that there are many, many cases from my casebook available in fine bookstores everywhere, and soon to be a major motion picture starring Jimmy Smits, whose TV show was canceled last week. Yeah, I know. He'll try another. He and I will try another. But it seems to me that academic freedom is under clear assault in our society. We have legislators who are trying to shut down law clinics who've won cases against powerful interests. We have legislatures that are requiring us to report our time, to hold office hours at certain periods of time. At even one institution, a public institution in the state of Texas, to evaluate them on how much money they brought in and what their value is in citation indices. We have threats. I have a colleague who represented a political candidate in Rwanda and was arrested for the pro bono assistance that he was providing her. These are real and genuine threats, and we all ought to rise up when they affect any of our colleagues, not simply say, boy, I'm sure glad I'm not in social work or that I don't teach biology because I'd have to deal with these students. No, if they're under assault, all of us are under assault. When Professor Davis was under assault, the entire faculty was under assault. And it shouldn't take us 50 years later to see that. So it is important that we extirpate these, that we teach our junior faculty what the appropriate norms are if you start hearing distressing signals from students, to correct senior faculty who may have gotten out of touch on these issues. If we don't do it, who will? I assure you that there are people who will move into the breach, and they are not the ones we want to be correcting ourselves, judging ourselves, evaluating ourselves. Moreover, we have internal threats that are even more troubling, because then we can't point to the bad guy legislators for this. If we put faculty members down or deny them promotions and tenure because of their viewpoints, because they're unpopular, because you don't agree with them, or because they didn't play ball with you, or for reasons that have nothing to do with quality, as is generally acknowledged, but more personality. I've had cases where colleagues are being judged by collegiality as an unpublished criterion, including one dean who, the year that I chaired the Promotion and Tenure Committee for the university, told me that she would be tenured except for her bad colleagueship. I said, you don't want to be telling me that. Under a deposition, I would tell the truth. And I said, I can't find any criterion in your published criteria that say they have to be good colleagues. I said, besides that, I couldn't get a quorum at most meetings if that were the criterion. Think about that. Think of how many of those other bad colleagues you wouldn't count if collegiality were a criterion. Or even how they would misjudge you as having been a bad colleague every once in a while simply because you won a snark contest. That's a contest that you'll not win time and time again. I think that if we don't police these, others will. They will do so, and we'll all be at risk. And only the safe and those who see students as customers, instead of people to be challenged, as adults to be tested, as audiences for ideas that they've probably never considered, that once you put it out there, you freely and openly allow disagreement, and that you not put people down because they don't come up with the same answer you did. I see a couple of law colleagues in the they used to say the Socratic method's the game only one can play. Or having an essay exam where the correct answer is yes. How can any of us ever defended him? He, by the way, couldn't find counsel to help him in his own faculty, and so he was pro se in front of this judge who had hauled him in with the marshals. I believe that it is a sacred calling to be a professor. I think with the way that the world is being reorganized, with the use of contingent faculty and video conferencing and video games and whatever passes for long-distance education, and the increasing workloads and attention to workload policies as attempts to squeeze more out of us, or as measures of how much money we bring in, as if that is somehow a measure of our worth, and with proprietary schools that don't have libraries, don't have campuses, have corporate structures and profit-making motives, and contingent faculty. Who is going to do the lifting when this is the brave new world? And I fear for the generation that follows us, people of my generation. I'm 59 years old. The next generation is going to find an empty vessel if we don't protect academic freedom, if we don't behave well, if we don't police our own, and if we don't remove the outliers and sanction them and rein them in. And that way, when the true challenges come to colleagues who refuse to stand up to the WAC committee, we can all stand behind them because we have staked out high ground. And we have not squandered it for the pottage that is the self-dealing, that is profit-driven, and that is in our own interest as opposed to the collective interest. I am honored to be in a tradition today of 20 years of rectifying an enormous mistake and a humiliating error on the part of the university. Would that many other institutions went into the confessional and corrected the mistakes with such a glorious opportunity as you have given me. Thank you all very much. And Professor Davis, I am sorry that your pain came to this wonderful opportunity for me. Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure to present the Martin Luther King Jr. Cesar Chavez Rosa Parks Visiting Professorship to our speaker today. The certificate reads, "This certifies that Michael A. Olivas served as a King Chavez Parks Visiting Professor at the University of Michigan, and is hereby granted all the rights, honors, and privileges thereunto appertaining. In witness whereof, the seals of the State of Michigan and the University of Michigan, and the signatures of the state legislators, university officers thereof, are hereto affixed. October the 10th to 11th, 2010, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor."
Thank you so much.
Professor Olivas has said he'd be willing to answer some questions. Please use the microphones.
I'd just like to know why the Attorney General hasn't signed this.
Thanks. That was really a great presentation. I really enjoyed it, particularly because you covered half the curriculum in my higher education law class here at the university. So that was it.
Those of you who don't know your Associate General Counsel, Jack, here he is. Be nice to your counsel.
Thanks. So listen, I'm wondering if you would talk for a couple of minutes about Garcetti, a recent Supreme Court decision that many faculties are concerned about in terms of the ability of faculty to comment on their institutions, particularly public institutions. It's one that it's had some cases that have followed it, and I think it's a threat to academic freedom, and certainly something that has many faculties concerned.
It is an important case, and the reason I didn't mention Garcetti is simply because I break out in tears as you read it. It is simply the most chilling academic freedom decision made not in the context of an institution, but in the context of a public employer. And Garcetti was the city attorney, who is a consultant to Law and Order kinds of shows in L.A. That are set in L.A. And he fired one of his staff attorneys for having she had indicated her dissatisfaction with the policy. There's actually a long line of these kinds of cases. The problem was that they all used to go for the employee. And this was the first one that actually went for the employer in a 5-4 decision that has fragged its way through higher ed, because, at least in public institutions, because what it does is it reduces what's considered a matter of public concern. Public concern always was the issue. If something is a matter of public concern, you're more likely to be able to say it without fear of retribution or retaliation. And this reduces that zone. And as a result, a number of both tenured and untenured, what I call pre-tenured faculty, have been dismissed, as well as just troublemakers. And while Garcetti was cited in the Ward Churchill case, I would just remind you that Ward Churchill was removed not for anything he ever did in a classroom, not for anything he did as an extramural utterance, but for something that he wrote that they later determined was perhaps not authentic. But this is a man who had the governor and the attorney general and a member of the board of trustees call for his firing, and they offered legislation to lower whatever his salary was. I'm just going to pick a number, say $100,000, to lower the budget at the University of Colorado Boulder by $100,000 plus benefits to get rid of him. And then they held what I consider to be a kangaroo court of some faculty who dismissed him for work that he had done over the last 20 years, openly and notoriously in plain sight. And I argued that, I don't want to defend Ward Churchill's scholarship. I'm not That's not my field of study. I don't do Indian history. That's not my, of course, neither did any of the reviewers do Indian history, nor did they find a native person to review it. But they dismissed him after all of this. I argued that this was like finding drugs in a car trunk after an illegal search. You can't use it after that. Now, does this mean he could have never been fired? No, but having done so within 6 months of his being outed by Fox News, that authoritative neutral arbiter, as making inflammatory statements. Now, what he said was stupid. There is no doubt that his point about little Eichmann's was harmful and stupid. But just like I think that these preachers and the religious fanatics who yell out that death should come to fags at military funerals, I think is going to win their case, because that's what we do. In order to have wonderful speech, we tolerate terrible speech that can be hurtful and harmful. As long as it's not untrue and is harmful, we have a lot of tolerance for this. This is what the First Amendment does. It protects the good and the bad and the truly ugly. And I can't imagine anything more harmful. And so Garcetti is a very troubling case, and I've been troubled by how many administrations, frankly, have employed it or brought cases against faculty, brought actions against faculty that they would have lost under Pickering, that they know they'll win under Garcetti, even though they don't say they're doing it. They include it in their briefs, and they argue this. And I think that it's throwing faculty to the wolves. And I think that if it reflects badly on faculty and allows you to get rid of dissident faculty, it's also going to allow you to get rid of troublesome administrators. I mean, this is something that turns around to bite you more often than not when you act badly and without principle. So I am very troubled by it. I didn't single it out simply because there's many, many cases. But this is a game changer. There's no doubt. And there's an increasing literature and litany of cases. I track these for the 4th edition of my case book, which is available in fine bookstores everywhere. And I'm up to 30 or 40 cases just in higher ed. As I say, even though it's not a higher ed case. Of course, neither was Pickering, and neither were some of the other ones, the glorious cases that we draw from. But this also goes to show how contingent these are. Faculty should behave well, and if you've done something bad enough to bring yourself to the attention of authorities in a Garcetti kind of manner, I would at least examine my behavior. I get hate mail all the time. I love hate mail. Last time I gave one of these lectures was in Nebraska, and it was about immigration. And before I got there, I had one threat, and I was the designated spear catcher. I mean, my job was to defend immigrants in Nebraska, where they're being overrun by Mexicans, as you can imagine, because of its proximity to the border. And someone wrote me in advance, what is it you Mexicans don't understand about illegal? And I sent him back a note saying, someone has hijacked your emails trying to make you look stupid. And he wrote back and he said, I believe this in my heart, and you will pay for this remark in Lincoln. And so, well, I'd rather have somebody email me than stalk me. Let's put it that way. Stalk me, like stand outside my house, attend places where I'm going to be, set up a log and a website saying where I'm going to be. Not that that would ever happen in Michigan with a public official. Garcetti is a terrible case. It's a terrible case. I don't see any way around it now. They will not take up another case like this for a number of years. And it also goes to show how developments in fields other than higher ed actually have direct bearing upon us, at least in public institutions. We're also under threat, in my view, from restructuring and other kinds of things. That's a different day. You bring me back on the 30th anniversary, I'll give that talk. If any of you are still here. Additional questions? If you haven't been turned to contingent faculty by then.
You admonished all of us to be attentive to policing our own ranks. And, I think we can look through the history of the making of any profession and the maintenance of any profession. Mm-hmm. Periodically, they go through these sort of self-purgings, collective self-purgings, as a way of proving to themselves and to their publics that they are indeed virtuous organizations, etc. But then when we put on top of that the danger within higher ed that we have all manner of dividing us, whether it's public or private, whether it's religious or non-religious. I could easily imagine myself very easily saying, well, that faculty member is at Regent University. What does he expect at a place like that? I can see the danger of all kinds of slippery slopes here about sort of bowing out, walking away from these, and not really challenging them when they might be very dangerous, because we do know what the downsides of some of these are.
Well, that's fair enough, and I'm not advocating Stalinist purges. I'm saying, though, that if you've got a faculty colleague who regularly sleeps with students, just to use one example of the many I could have, I think that a dean who allows that to happen is not doing his or her job properly. And there are several ways you can deal with that. As associate dean, I will say that I know whereof I speak. And I have a good friend who never got over the generation gap or the sense of entitlement that he was entitled to sleep with his students. And after he was defended by a major Western institution in the same city where Garcetti was tried, he was told by the University Council, we defended you this time, we will not indemnify you next time. My guess is he got the message. I'm not talking about Stalinist purges because I don't agree with the scholarship of some young crit or more likely a Republican conservative with whose views I don't truck, or someone that I consider to be a nativist and restrictionist, whereas I'm for godlessness, wrought large. I don't expect everybody to agree with me, and I would never go after someone or headhunt someone because I disagreed with them on that. But I'm talking here about what's clearly outlined behavior. Someone who, and sometimes, by the way, we just don't hear ourselves. I tape myself at least once a year as just a sense that I'm doing okay. And I realized in one of my classrooms there's a hum in the back, and I can't hear questions that come very well. And so I scratch up my face, and it looked like I was disapproving. And students that term said that I was really critical of students who asked questions. And I actually think I was no more intolerant than I usually am, except I think I came across as not listening because I was grimacing because I couldn't hear. I haven't had that in my evaluation since that time. And by the way, I get those like Sami-san, and I read them carefully because I want to know how I'm doing. I really do. And if students complain about there being too much work, no problem. They always think that I'm too pro-immigrant. That's sort of the risk. Any Mexican's going to be. You can't teach immigration without being pro-immigrant, in my view. But I would never, if I had a colleague who taught it and was very pro-enforcement, I would never try and change his or her views on that. But if I found them engaging in this behavior, if I found them acting badly in the ways that I've suggested, especially exploiting students, I had a colleague, not at the University of Houston, I visited a couple of other schools, where I thought students were violating with this professor's permission, or at least his tacit approval, the rule against using written material both for law review and for class credit. And a couple of students came to me and complained. I'm not sure why me, because I wasn't a member of the faculty. I was a visitor, so they came, and I taught higher ed law, and a student came to complain to me about this. Almost all the things I've ever discovered, students have come to bring to me. Now that, of course, doesn't mean that students always tell the truth. Students may have a self-interest. They may get it wrong. They may have misapprehended something, et cetera, et cetera. But I will say that if two students come to you about something, there's probably, maybe not fire, but there may be smoke. And I've been around. I observe. This is what I do. I'm very pro-faculty. For someone to be an outlier to me means they've got to be pretty far off the grid. And I think that it's my job at least to warn them about being on the grid. because it will come back to haunt them. I have been in faculty meetings. I have a colleague on a committee that had to do with hiring who said, I don't really like his work, but I think he'd be a sweet colleague. Now, what does that code word mean to any of you? A sweet colleague? I said, Jim, Bob, Joe, I'm going to have to answer truthfully in our deposition that you're saying this. What do you mean by that? He wanted to not hire him because the guy was gay. It was very clear to me. This guy was a member of an important gay legal organization, had all the merit badges, and someone is saying this kind of shit in front of me. And I just, that's where I draw the line. I don't know where the line is, but whatever it is, he's past, it's behind him. And I would say that it's rare that a year goes by where something like that doesn't happen. And it's not because I've got thin skin. I'm the oldest of 10. I'm a vigorous consumer of my academic freedom rights. I call it like I see them, so much so that I get hate mail. I'm a spear catcher in Nebraska. And one time after I wrote the top 10% plan legislation in Texas, I had an inmate write me complaining about the top 10% plan. An inmate! Inmates are dissing me. I wrote, saying that I thought that, I wrote an editorial saying that I thought that alumni privilege was wrong. And after Texas A&M, after Hopwood, after Grutter, thank you all very much, and after Hopwood was overturned, Texas A&M, after a searching study, decided they weren't going to use race, they're going to use merit, but they're going to keep it the Aggie Legacy Program, which I call the Agassi Program, with all apologies to Alex Agassi. God, this is a tough group. Aggie Legacy Policy. And I told my wife they gave 4 points out of 100 to people who had fathers, mothers, grandparents, brothers, or sisters attend Texas A&M. And 4 points out of 100 meant that in any given year, they admitted more students under that than they had ever admitted Mexican-American students in the entire university. And I said, and I signed it, and I sent that in with a black colleague who is chair of the Senate Finance Committee in the state of Texas, with fiscal responsibility for colleges and universities. Within 4 days, they had retracted their policy. And I started getting hate mail, and I had regents calling me, and my president called me in, and he said, Michael, he said, I'm pleased that you did this. He said, but next time, would you just tell me so I can defend your right to say this? And I said, well, sure, I actually sent you a copy. If you go back and read your emails, I wanted you to know. That's, if I hadn't had tenure, if I hadn't exercised my freedom. So I know where to draw the line. And I've gone over it a couple of times, probably in my enthusiasm or in my shaming techniques. I'm not a perfect person. I'm not going to give you a Glenn Beck kind of thing and dissolve into tears. But there are fights I wish I had picked. I probably chose the wrong side in some issues, but I will tell you that I feel that if we don't do it internally, someone's going to do it. And it's going to be a lot worse, and they're going to be a lot less qualified than I am. And I'm willing to accept the collective judgment if the group says, well, that's not out of bounds. And I have. I've lost these, all of us have. I've lost these fights. And that's where it belongs. And I believe that's protected behavior. Even Garcetti, I believe, would probably save me on that, because it is internal. But it's not a matter of public concern, and that is often used as the wedge against faculty performing their governance duties. I just think we have to take that seriously. So I appreciate the caution, and I'm not advocating that you ever go against someone because of what they believe. It's the way they act. And by the way, I have a large tolerance for that. I've seen a lot of acceptable behavior in my life, but when it goes overboard, I think you got to call them on it. I one time acted in a certain way that someone said was headhunting, and I didn't mean it. And I was appreciative when the person told me that, and I was embarrassed for weeks. I have self-corrective mechanisms. I know it doesn't seem like it now, but I really am a thoughtful person when it comes to this kind of discourse. It's when I leave campus that I just lose all control.
The University of Michigan Senate's annual Davis Markert Nickerson Lecture on Academic and Intellectual Freedom is supported in part by contributions by the public to the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund and might qualify for both Michigan as well as federal income tax deductions. If you wish to contribute to the fund, checks should be made payable to AFLF and mailed to Post Office Box 4152, Ann Arbor, Michigan 48106-4152. Alternatively, checks may be made payable to the University of Michigan AFLF and mailed to the same address. These latter contributions will be invested in a University of Michigan account entitled Academic Freedom Lecture Fund, which is under the joint stewardship of both the University of Michigan Senate Advisory Committee on University Affairs and the Board of Directors of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund. Individuals who contribute become members of the Academic Freedom Lecture Fund and will receive information about activities sponsored by the fund. The Academic Freedom Lecture Fund is a Section 501c3 nonprofit organization. All contributions to it are tax deductible under IRS regulations.